Ya estamos al aire.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a este segundo día de sesiones del simposio. For our colleagues connected in Zoom, I'm going to introduce the day in Spanish and then to summarize what I say in English. Is it translated? But in Spanish, yes. Okay. La traducción. El día de hoy vamos a tener traducción. Los ponentes van a estar hablando todos ellos en inglés, pero ustedes van a poder observar los subtítulos en español. Para la gente que habla en inglés, nosotros vamos a hacer la traducción porque el subtitulado solo es en español, ¿vale? For the people who is presenting in English, the English speakers, we are going to help with the translation as the subtitles are just in Spanish in this version of the technical tools, digital tools. So, thank you very much for your patience with this. Queremos hacer un agradecimiento muy importante al Instituto de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades de la Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla por alojarnos, por patrocinar también este evento. A continuación, yo voy a ser el guardián del tiempo, voy a estar llevando el tiempo, así que estaré pasando a sus lugares en el momento de las preguntas. Y no se olviden que vamos a tener al final del día un espacio para una discusión colectiva. Así que si sus preguntas o comentarios no pueden ser propuestos directamente a los ponentes, podemos hacerlo al final del día en la discusión colectiva. We are having a collective discussion slot at the end of the day, where some questions and remaining commentaries are going to be said and some discussion is going to be opened. Muy bien, muchas gracias. Le paso la palabra a mis colegas Liz de Freitas y Natalie Sinclair.
¿Y tú?
Yo soy Armando Solares y junto con Carlos Sayas, que está allá atrás ocupándose de los detalles técnicos, les damos la bienvenida.
Gracias. Bienvenidos a todos. My name is Elizabeth de Freitas, and we would just want to share reflections, a few reflections on yesterday's proceedings, especially for those who were unable to attend and who are now on the Zoom or the YouTube. So Natalie and I opened the day with a discussion of our project, with Armando and Carlos, sharing some of the visualizations of our research, our attempt to visualize the Palafoxiana archive, which is the library where we were studying. The project is specifically focused on better understanding the nature of mathematics in the 17th century, but in particular, the specific kind of mathematical knowledge and material practices that we find here in New Spain, that seem to have flourished here in this particular place, especially in Puebla. The project is also motivated to make sense of these mathematical practices in terms of the political and economic complexity of settler colonialism in the Americas. And we used the term Baroque mathematics yesterday, and we introduced it at the beginning of the day, kind of like an analytic device as a way of characterizing the mathematics. We put forward a few ideas just to spark conversation that have emerged for us in our research. to help do that. So we mentioned the rise of combinatoric mathematics to explore plurality, proliferation, the fold, in music as well as in other modes of mathematical thinking. We also mentioned the ecstatic journey and the way in which mathematics could function as an instrument of the imagination for some of the mathematicians and scholars that we are investigating. And we also mentioned the role of paradox in mathematical thinking and in practices and in the particular books that we are investigating. And finally, we mentioned syncretism and the ways in which 17th century scholars were drawing on ancient wisdoms and origin stories, either Pythagorean or Nahuatl and Mesoamerican in this context. So we had 4 wonderful papers in the from Fabian Valdivia, Robert Jackson, Laura Chazaran, and Carlos Hugo Zayas. The discussions were about the role of instrument makers here in New Spain, and also in the surveying of scientific enterprise and mapping, which was so important at that time here as part of the process of transformation. We also spoke about the role of mathematical diagrams, and very specific printing practices and reading practices associated with the 17th century, and in particular tracking changes in mathematical texts, both here in Puebla, but also in Europe. And we also discussed the ways in which story and narrative, and in the particular Carlos's paper on the stories of the lives of the saints, how those might be studied to understand a particular mode of scientific observation or prediction that was being developed alongside more canonical forms of scientific emergence in the Baroque period. So our job today is to continue this work on developing and teasing out aspects and subtleties regarding the many faces of the Baroque. One or two key questions that emerged yesterday that could be returned to, I think, today, both at, we do actually have an earlier discussion period at 12 as well. I would just want to mention not just at the end of the day, but at the end of the morning. So 2 key questions. What is the role of observation in the various cases we are investigating yesterday and today? There are wonderful new researchers who will be speaking today and who will introduce soon enough. Not just the role of observation, but the role of the senses, of vision, material media. How is that playing such a big part in the development of a Baroque science and a Baroque math? Second question that came up that we would love to revisit too is what is the relationship at this time between logic and mathematics, or logic and mathematics within this realm of the Baroque that we are exploring, and what kinds of images of reasoning or of proof, what kind of practices of proof and of inference do we see in the mathematical compendia or in other related manuscripts that our various participants are investigating.
Thank you, Liz. Hola. My name is Natalie Sinclair from Simon Fraser University, and just adding to what Liz said, I think a very important theme yesterday was at the methodological level, which is the importance of studying not just what's happening at the center, but also at the periphery, and looking at the minor practices that are happening at the periphery, whether it's a Jesuit unknown Criollo mathematician working out how to create his diagrams for his manuscript, or the Jesuit missionaries who are figuring out how much money they can spend on building a church, or the people who are trying to fix the instruments that have come over from Europe and participate in the practice of observing that Liz has mentioned. So I think a third question coming out of yesterday is how much our understanding of what Baroque mathematics might be needs to be situated in these very minor practices that give a lot of texture and nuance to what Baroque mathematical practice might look like. So let us turn now to our first speaker. We are thrilled that Dr. Raz Chen Morris is joining us. He's associate professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the history department. And he's a world expert on Kepler's optics and has written several books and papers on that topic. I wanted to mention a couple, which was his book on measuring shadows from 2016, I think, and then the prior book that he co-wrote, which is the main reason he's here today, on Baroque science. And without further ado, Dr. Chen Morris, I'm going to pass the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really interesting, and I'm so happy to see that this notion of Baroque science, not just as a kind of a step relation to the main science, but as a defining characteristic of the new science is something people talk about and pursue the investigation. What I will try to present today is some thoughts and directions that followed my Baroque science, mine and Offergal Baroque science project. As Natalie mentioned, as an expert on Kepler, Kepler will play some major role in these reflections. But let's just start. I'll start by sharing the presentation. What I would like to present today is the way that some sort of an inner dynamic within my previous notion of Baroque science, that whereas the author and I concentrated on the camera obscura and stressed the way that this instrument became a model of the eye in the early 17th century with the works of Kepler and Descartes and others. And we sort of, around this instrument, we suggested that one of the main paradoxes of Baroque science is that the eye doesn't see, that the eye is just an instrument that allow light to pass through it, refract through it, and actually vision itself happens somewhere else. And that this sort of separation between the inner mind, where the processing of the visual data is performed, and the external world is a major epistemological shift in the Baroque. What I will try to do today is to sort of show how the telescope fits into this premise, and how the telescope changes the dynamic of Baroque science, opening possibilities for fantasy and for scientific fantasy, as well as changing senses of sovereignty and power. So let me begin. And the main thing is to understand the difference between the camera obscura and the telescope. And the difference lies in the fact that the camera obscura is actually a natural phenomenon. It's something that happens naturally wherever we see light passes through a crack or between the leaves of a tree. We see this sort of pinhole image of the sun on the floor or on our body. If you sit under a tree, you'll see that you have sort of round stains of light appearing on your body or on the body of the person who sits with you, near you. And it's actually something very natural and something that therefore bothered many scholars since the days of pseudo-Aristotle, Problemata, through the Middle Ages to Kepler. And as Kepler describes it, the ray of the sun, just a second, cast in through any kind of crack, falls in the form of a circle upon a plane object, is a fact obvious to everyone. This is seen beneath roofs that are split open, enshrine perforated window panes, and beneath any tree. In contrast, the telescope is completely artificial. The image that we receive through a telescope is something that doesn't happen in nature. We don't see lenses running around wild in nature, coming together to produce images of distant objects. And when Kepler introduces the telescope in his Dioptrics, a small treatise he wrote after he had the chance to examine Galileo's celebrated instrument, there he says, in recent years, the dioptric pipe, certainly not to be counted among common contrivances, was added to the great heap of inventions of this last century. Because for Kepler, it was obvious that the telescope is not like the pinhole image, the image that kind of passes through a crack in the wall, but is something that human-made, human invention, completely artificial. And this just a second. And this accentuated the fact that the telescope is a production of deformed curvatures. And I brought here Borromedes' famous deformed church, where you have concave and convexes sort of snaking through the building, something that was presented that kind of challenged the taste of early 17th century Europeans, to show how this idea of putting two opposing curvature, convex and concave, together was something that was scandalous, something that was sort of inviting not knowledge, but presumably deformation. But for Kepler, this is the basic of the telescope, the fact that separatedly about convex lenses and separately about concave ones, now about concave and convex lenses joined together. This is the moment that the telescope is created, that the way that we produce knowledge from two deformities, two curvatures that are not regular and nicely spherical, but are twisted to produce knowledge. And for Kepler, the telescope also was a chance to present a new science, as he says in the letter of to his patron of the Dioptrics. I have opened a new field for mathematicians to exercise the power of ingenuity. That is to employ the principles of geometry in the demonstration of the causes that underpin such sought-after and delightfully various and numerous effects. The stress here is about that the principle of geometry demonstrate causes. And that's sort of breaking or erasing the demarcating line between mathematics and physics. Physics or natural philosophy is the discipline that deals with causes, and suddenly geometry, the principle of geometry, are demonstrating the causes of effects of physical phenomena. And then he explains the place of this new science, dioptrics, in the scheme of optics. And what's interesting here, I won't read the whole paragraph, that dioptrics comes first, that the science that deals with refractions is the foundation of optics, not direct vision, not the simple act of sight, not catoptrics with the mirrors, but actually the more contrived, the more artificial, the more distorting phenomena of refraction is the foundation of optics. The optics comes first, catoptrics follows, above all because catoptrics is concerned with images, the true nature of which cannot be fully understood without knowledge about the eye that must be obtained from the optics. The eye itself, direct vision itself, that for the medieval perspectivists was the paradigm or the main subject of optics, becomes subservient or a result of a system of refractions. And the artificiality of the telescope also invites new mode of producing knowledge. No longer in the camera obscura, passively observing shadows and images flowing through the hole in the wall, but a manipulative mode of producing knowledge. In order to understand things, we have to experiment with them, and I think it's very surprising for people who have some sort of an image of Kepler as a recursive, contemplative, Neoplatonic mathematician, to see that he's actually suggesting an experimental science, an experimental mathematical science. Opening the dioptrics, he doesn't introduce to us refractions, the first three propositions, but he introduces refraction only in the fourth, which is a problemata, which is a practical mode of producing refractions and measuring them. There are no refractions before we produce them and measure them, as in this strange contriveness of a wooden frame and a glass cube through which rays of light pass, and we can measure the angles of refraction accordingly. Or in a later place where he asked the reader to depict visible object on a white wall with a convex lens. He takes the camera obscura and add a lens to manipulate the images that flow through the hole. So we have a new sort of knowledge where we have to produce the phenomenon that we want to explain. That the truth it comes out through making, through manipulating natural objects. I hope that until now I kind of suggested very quickly the main tenet of what I think the telescope epistemologically suggested for Kepler, and I think for others in the same period, that it's a new kind of knowledge based on manipulating lenses produced by men artificially, by humans artificially, and that does not allow the scientist to be a contemplative, recursive, passive observer of nature, but ask the scientist to do something, to take lenses, put them together in a tube, play with the distances between the lenses, play with the shape of the lenses, so they can produce images, or she can produce images of the object, the observed object. The telescope, the other thing that the telescope should suggest is that we need to fully develop our power of imagination, of power of fantasy. The images that come through the lenses are blurred, are not clear, lots of aberrations, especially in the early telescopes, and we need, the observer needs to shape these stains of light and the shadows that come through the telescope into some sort of an image, using the imagination as a crucial tool in that respect. And that almost immediately suggests that the imagination can do more than that. If we can just put the shadows of the moon and turn them into mountains and valleys and seas and lakes, maybe we can also imagine other things as we observe the moon. And as Kepler, in a letter from around 1620, writes to his friend Benneger, says, "An experiment with the telescope I had carried out recently produced a marvelous sight, altogether remarkable, cities and walls which were circular because of the shape of the umbra. What more should I say? Campanella wrote his City of the Sun, and if we were to write a City of the Moon, wouldn't it be excellent to paint the Cyclopean Moors of our time in lively colors, but leave the earth behind and go to the moon for the sake of prudence? But what is the good of such evasive action, since neither More in his Utopia nor Erasmus in his Praise of Folly were so well protected that they didn't have to defend themselves? We must forsake the political tar pit and stay within the green pleasant plains of philosophy." And the green pleasant plains of philosophy for Kepler was to write his Somnium, his celebrated dream, coming up posthumously in 1634, where he describes the meeting of the protagonist of the dream with a demon that tells the protagonist about traveling to the moon and back, and about the geography and astronomy of the moon. The whole, this new way of telling about astronomical knowledge captivated many people in the 17th century, and we have a whole genre following Kepler of traveling to the moon. I will just kind of mention here two modes of writing about it. One, John Wilkins, an English mathematician who, as a young mathematician in 1638, writes a book called The First Discovery of a New World on the Moon, where he suggests that a plurality of worlds does not contradict any principle of reason or faith, and then later that this probable there may be that it is probable that may be inhabitants in this other world, but of what kind they are is uncertain. And a few propositions later, that it is possible for some or posterity to find out convenience to this other world, and if there be inhabitants there, to have commerce with them. So, Wilkins immediately think about, like it's the early phases of the English Empire, already of colonizing and commercing with the people of the moon or of Jupiter, trying to enlarge the British Empire to much more distant places than the Americas or India. This is a more, Wilkins' book is a more of a practical, almost kind of, if we follow the new astronomy, we have to admit that the planets are like the Earth, therefore there should be people there, therefore we should have ability sometime in the future to travel there and to have commerce with them. The other option was to write a complete fantasy. I think the most radical one was Cyrano de Bergerac, in the 1650s, where he wrote Histoire comique des États Empires de la Lune. Sorry for my French accent, apologies for that. A wild story of how he traveled to the moon and the several experiments he did with traveling. At the end, he's managing to lift his body with magnets that kind of using the opposite poles of the magnet to so they can not attract, but pushes his body up in the air into the beyond the atmosphere to the moon. And then the strange stories, most of them also sort of sexually and politically irreverent. And that's the other option of telling the fantasy about traveling of the moon. All these, both Kepler, Wilkins, I should mention Francis Goodwin and Bergerac, have on the basic point of departure is the Copernican astronomy, and it's a sort of proving Copernicus through fantasy. This received a philosophical clear philosophical formulation with Descartes, who actually invites his followers to imagine a new world. That in order to produce science, in order to make knowledge, we have to use the imagination, and not only that, as he says, since everything I propose here can be imagined distinctly, it is certain that even if there were nothing of this sort in the old world, God can nevertheless create it in a new one, for it is certain that he can create everything we imagine. So suddenly it's not what we think, and it's not I think therefore I am, but I imagine therefore I can know it. If I can imagine it distinctly with all the details and coherently, so there's no contradiction between the different parts of my imaginations, and that's maybe a sort of differentiation between madness and philosophy. If I can imagine distinctly, God can create it and I can know it because I imagine it. Again, if I can produce it, like the refraction, I can know it. If I can imagine it, suddenly the knowledge becomes dependent on the abilities of the human who investigates nature. But if we can imagine new worlds, we can imagine new polities, can imagine new modes of power and sovereignty. And here the new science, this sort of new science, this sort of the telescope addressed a continuous problem of early modern politics. The need for legitimation that especially after Machiavelli exposed the inner working, the inner mechanisms of politics, and the need of the prince to show that he is not only a Machiavellian, an administrator, but he also a philosopher, somebody who has some sort of a divine inspiration, that is engaged in remove mysteries, as Ben Jonson called it. And these removed mysteries, the more he was engaged with them, he was more respected, but at the same time had less ability to engage with the politics, with administrating his kingdom. This is very nicely put in Shakespeare, The Tempest, where Prospero described the way he gave away his kingdom for his studies. He was respected, he was immersed in the liberal arts, in secret studies, and he gave his brother to control the land. And something that I think Shakespeare wrote it with Rudolph II and his brother Matthias in mind. But this sort of dichotomy and contradiction between the administrator and philosopher king, this was unresolved and actually caused much of at least for some of the people in the 17th century, saw it as a cause for the problem of establishing sovereign power and stability in the politics. What Kepler suggests with the telescope is that actually this new science can serve as an ideal, as a new ideal for the prince, as in not only a contemplative knowledge, removed mysteries, but knowledge that is produced through making. That there's no contradiction between administrating the state and being a philosopher king. Already in the Dioptric, he says, "O telescope, instrument of much knowledge, more precious than any scepter, is not he who holds thee in his hand made king and lord of the works of God." Like this sort of connection between having a telescope and being a sovereign is already kind of put forward. And if I have a time, I will mention that Kepler receives the telescope from the Archbishop of Köln for the first time when the Archbishop comes to Prague to try to negotiate between Rudolf and Matthias, between the two brothers. And later in the Harmonices Mundi, he writes to King James I of England, of Britain actually, "Yet no one should prevent me from touching on this feature long recognized by the whole world of the glory of your deeds, that having obtained the kingdom of England by inheritance and by the agreement of the people, you soon gave it the name in common with the kingdom of Scotland, of Great Britain. From the combination of both provinces, you produce one kingdom and one harmony. For what else is a kingdom but a harmony?" So a new image of the prince that produces harmony through his political action, not by contemplating harmonies, but through real politics, come forward.
5 more minutes, please.
Okay, so actually I'll try to make it short because it's and maybe repeat at some points of that because I kind of run, I think, quite quickly through and that kind of produces a new optics of power. A new optics of power where the king or prince he controls both the church and the state, as in Hobbes' famous Leviathan, where he becomes an image, a fictive image of unity of the people, of this new harmony that he produces between the different sorts of groups that gather around, under his protection. And he's bringing these things together, even though they might be contradictory, but by producing harmony. And also I must mention here that for Kepler, harmony can be produced and can be heard only if we have also discordant sounds between the harmonious notes. In order to hear harmony, we need to hear disharmony as well. We cannot have just harmonious music. It has to be interrupted with sort of things that kind of disturb the harmony, disharmonious sounds. And that's why he sings that plurality of people in the kingdom, both Calvinists, Lutheran, and Catholics, doesn't undermine the kingdom, but can be a source of power, because then the king can produce harmony between these separate groups of between these separate confessions. And as we see this anamorphous play game where the head of Charles I is reproduced. Don't forget that he lost his head in 1649 when he was executed, literally lost his head when he was executed by Cromwell and his Puritan army. This little game from the 1670s shows us how to reassemble the head through this cylindrical glass and produce this sense of unity of power from a chaotic smear of paint and suggesting a new mode of power that is not through performance of violence, but through science and knowledge, producing an image of coherence and stability. Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias. Wonderful. So again, we will have time for more discussion questions on these papers just before lunch at around noon or so. We're running approximately on time. So I'd like to...
I'm saying, as I said before, I apologize that I will have to leave now. I'll try to come back towards 1 o'clock, your time, and be there for the questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is really an honor.
Thank you for your talk. Great. So we're going to turn to our second speaker. Me gustaría presentarles a Fernando Zalamea. Profesor Zalamea es matemático y además filósofo y historiador de las matemáticas. Es conocido por su filosofía synthetic philosophy, and his work, his knowledge and his work on philosopher Charles Peirce, as well as many, many other things. We are very, very happy to have him here speaking. And he is currently a professor in the Department of Mathematics at the University of Columbia. Bienvenido. We're very interested to hear your talk, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Freitas, for the presentation and for the kind invitation. I will share my presentation. So thanks again for the organizers and for the beautiful meeting. I will make a very brief commentary on some work that I made 30 years ago, comparing some scientific motives in the arts of Colombia and Mexico in the colonial times. It will be the content of my presentation. It will be very short. I will recall very briefly what I did 30 years ago. Luckily, what was done 30 years ago or what is done today or what will be done 30 years from now about these things don't change very much. What changes are the interpretations. So I will talk a little about interpretations and that will be it. I will have this brief introduction to the motifs, very, very brief. I will spare you all the details of that. And then what I will try to present today are two interpretations of the comparisons between Colombia and Mexico of the scientific motifs that I found in the arts of the two regions. One to Peirce, that Professor De Freitas said I worked a lot of years around Peirce, and one around more modern mathematics of our times that I think in spirit are extremely Baroque. So this is a catalog of the scientific motifs that I found in the arts of New Spain and New Granada. I did in situ work on Colombia, going to the churches and museums in Colombia and looking for the arts and comparing in the artistic representations what was found about things which were scientific. You can see there, for example, geography, machines, zodiac, flora, etc. I will not go, of course, into all of these details. And the catalog on Colombia was more or less exhaustive. And what I tried to do is to compare with that catalog with some of the things that were known in the literature on New Spain, on the arts of New Spain, and the scientific motifs that were found there. There were the Mexican perspective was just representative for me. The one more exhaustive was Colombia. But this is found, if you are interested afterwards, in an article that was published like 30 years ago in Mexico, in which I explain with all detail the descriptions of the motifs that I found in New Spain and New Granada, and I began to try to make a comparison. This is what I want to do today, to compare a little the two top contexts. First, using a little of Peirce. In Peirce, you know very well, in Peirce, the semiotic of Peirce is tripartite. The sign in Peirce is triadic, in which you have an icon if you are just representing an object, but if the representation is good enough to capture the semantics, you have an index, and afterwards, if the representation is good enough to capture not just the syntaxis and the semantics, but also the pragmatics behind, then you have a symbol. So my first interpretation is that if we look at the artistic representations of science in New Spain, I think that we can talk about some complex strata and some dense symbolic context in the sense of Peirce, in which you have enough presences of science and mathematics in the representations of the art. And those representations not only talk about practices, but also some kind of speculative, very interesting part of the work, in which that speculation is also related to what Professor Freitas was in a moment talking about the syncretism. The syncretism in New Spain is very strong, and you have a lot of presences that you can see in architecture, in the representations of the biombos, in the catafalques, in many places you can see how this going back and forth between science or mathematics and the arts can be very strong. So at the level of New Spain, we have enough complex strata and enough symbolic context to talk about presences of science and mathematics at some kind of speculative level, not just practical level. Instead, I think that in New Granada, in my country, in Colombia, the absences are much more wider. There are a lot of mathematical absences. I think that instead of having a very complex architecture, we have some simple planes, what I call a discrete indexical context in the sense of Peirce, in which we have some scientific presences, but more or less related to the practice of science, astronomy, medicine, engineering, not really speculative in that sense. But that's also interesting because, as Professor Sinclair was talking, this kind of absence in the periphery is also very indicative. And that's clear in the way of if we introduce an allegory of Kircher in which you have lights and shadows, we can obtain a lot of information from the shadow, from what is not known, from what is lesser important from the periphery, from the shadow of the periphery. We can get a lot of very interesting information. That information is called through Peirce as a discrete indexical against the dense symbolic in New Spain. So there are differences which can be obtained through semiotics, and which come back also to the bigger the bigger allegories of the Baroque. Kircher is certainly one. Another one interesting is the Opticorum of Aguilonius. Certainly, you know much better than me the Oropteron by Aguilonius, in which the Oropter is a kind of a line between the middle of the eyes and the focal point where the eyes converge, in which, in a sense, Aguilonius is trying to make the idea that when you have the concept of two in one, then you are looking better. When you have two in one, then you are opening your eyes in a certain sense. This is related to what Professor Chen Morris was saying little time ago. When you join together harmony and disharmony, or when you join together convex and concave, you are beginning to see. So the two in one is very, very important for the Baroque period. And I think that's something which will be more important either for the mathematics of the modern times. So I will speak very briefly about those mathematics of the modern times. The two in one by Aguilonius, it can be expressed in our times by a generalization of the situation, n in one, n perspectives in one, when that n can be either finite or infinite, even infinite, in which you have some space on the bottom, then you have a lot of perspectives on that space, and then you join all together, all the perspectives together. That's called a topos by Grothendieck in the 1960s, a new understanding of space through the multiplicity of perspectives. Usually the multiplicity of perspectives doesn't allow you to see very well, but if you unite the multiplicity of perspectives in one, some kind of Aguilonius of today, then you get a very good understanding of the mathematics which is behind. These are called sheaves in mathematics, in which you fold and unfold on a space. You have a folded space on the base, you unfold the space from the space from the bottom, and then the going back and forth between the local and the global gives you the understanding of what is happening there. Spaces, projections, fibers, sections are fundamental for our mathematical understanding today, and I think they were also fundamental for the Baroque times. Clear, for example, here in the Organum Mathematicum of Kircher. Without the technical tools that we have today, we have a lot of more precise technical tools like these sheaves and the Grothendieck toposes. But I think that there is a kind of a very strange and very interesting continuity between Aguilonius, Kircher, and Grothendieck, for example. And in the middle, we have, of course, Deleuze. Deleuze is extremely important for an understanding of the Baroque. Some of the traits, fundamental traits of the fold by Deleuze, in which you have the fold, the invention of the infinite work with different scales, fundamental, this hierarchy of scales, the inside and the outside, confronting the two principles, the high and the low, the infinite who goes all the time back and forth between many levels, the unfold, some kind of going to the residues. When you have a residue, then you have the whole thing at the same time. Textures in the middle, that was also mentioned in the discussion before. And the paradigm, the fundamental paradigms where you understand the Baroque through the excesses of infinity. So Deleuze did a beautiful diagram of that basic idea. This is in his book also. The Baroque, he calls it the Baroque house, the allegory of the Baroque house, where you have the five senses. The five senses converge in this fold and unfold of the understanding of the world, where the senses and the ratio at the same time go back and forth together and produce a beautiful understanding. But when you need multiplicity, the multiplicity, and then the multiplicity, the plurality is in a sense united in one kind of this decorated private room with diversified by folds. So we have this kind of two-in-one in Aguilonius, the plurality in Deleuze. We have the n-in-one in Grothendieck. We have all the machinery by Kircher. And I will be finishing with my my main point today, in which I will spend a little more time, but very quickly also, this diagram. I want to present you this diagram, which is a kind of synthesis of everything that I said today and before, in which we can show with a very simple diagram this back and forth of the left. At the left, you have the fundamental traits of the left, the folding and the unfolding, the low and the high, the inside and the outside. In the middle, you have the textures, and in the bottom, you have the padding of infinity, in which you need the infinity in order to make all the system work. This can be presented in this diagram. This is called the Riemann surface. This was invented by Riemann, one of the greatest, probably the greatest geometer of all times in the 19th century. I am talking today very, very quickly about Grothendieck and Riemann. I would certainly say that Riemann and Grothendieck are probably the greatest mathematician of the last 200 years. So they are very quickly synthesized here. This takes a lot of time to develop, but it can be synthesized here, in which you have in a bottom like the basis, the European Baroque, and then you have the false, the syncretism, the plurality in the New Spain Baroque, which seems a very natural counterpart, and then in a much lesser way, the Baroque of Colombia, which is much more poor compared with the Mexican Baroque. But it is interesting, as Professor Sinclair was saying, that to the periphery of the periphery, we can obtain a lot of information. Already Mexico was the periphery of Spain, but Colombia is the periphery of Mexico, and in this kind of continuing back and forth between the residues, the small residues that you get in New Granada are informing you a lot about what was happening in the whole picture. The foldings and the unfoldings of the art and the science can be represented in this picture here, and this extremely detailed and extremely local catalog of a lot of very, very particular and very local things that were done in small towns of Colombia, or bigger moments in Mexico, etc. Those things are like residues for me, like small residues, small ruins, which show the biggest picture. The biggest picture is the one which is presented here, where you have the different layers, the hierarchy, and the hierarchy gives you a kind of information. You've seen also the allegories of Professor Chen Morris. You have a kind of small telescope in which the European Baroque can be seen with the telescope from New Granada. You need a big telescope, a lesser big telescope in Spain Baroque to understand what's happening there. But in these different kind of layers, you can see interesting differences which show the richness of the Baroque. And the richness of the Baroque is also represented here in these very quick Persian representations about the complex strata in New Spain and the more simple plane in New Granada. So this going back and forth shows you the possibilities, the multiplication of possibilities of all these kind of different representations. And this is more or less what I wanted to say, just show you that with some modern mathematical tools, we have a kind of strange and nice conceptual continuity with the Baroque. I even would say that Grothendieck which is a gigantic mathematician, could be defined as a very, very gigantic Baroque mathematician for today. So using his tools, which I was very quick here to present one of them, he has an infinity of them, which are extremely interesting. We can draw the kind of conceptual differences between the center, the periphery, and the periphery of the periphery. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you very much, Professor Zalamea. We have a few minutes for some questions here in this room, and maybe for YouTube. ¿Alguna pregunta para tenemos unos minutos, 5 minutos para preguntas y comentarios? ¿Hay alguna pregunta aquí en el salón? Sí, te llevo el micrófono.
Good morning, Fernando Zalamea. I have a question for you. I have been doing some research on the books that were read, probably used in the 16th century here in Mexico, in Puebla and Mexico City particularly. And some of those books, I found them in the schools and the patrimonial libraries that were part of the Jesuits. And you said that Jesuits, Kircher, was a Neoplatonic, and most of the books that I found that were part of the Jesuit schools, they were mostly from scholasticism, actually. Most of the authors were scholastics, and they had this traditional methodology of writing that comes from scholasticism. And so I wonder, my question is, from that data, I normally conclude that most of the philosophy and science that Jesuits and in general Franciscans and Dominicans here in Mexico, in Spain, most of that philosophy and science was Aristotelian, so because it was scholastic. And so my question is, from which data do you conclude that is Neoplatonic most of the books and information that Jesuits and people from the 17th century read and form as Neoplatonics?
No, I agree completely with you. I think that the dominant force in that time was the scholasticism. But what I was trying to tell here is that beyond the main trends, there were still kind of traditions, figural traditions like this one in Agulonius or the ones in Kircher, etc., in which the visual perspective is fundamental. But this is kind of not the central trend. This is more like aside. Is what I was trying to say, to call the residues, what is not at the center. The center is the scholasticism, certainly, but I was interested in what is not at the center, in what is in the residues, in the borders, and in those borders, more than the strict language, for example, of the scholastic philosophy, the idea of trying to learn through visual apparatus is very interesting to me. So I was trying to bring Kircher and Aguilonius in the perspectives, but and because my work, the beginning of my work was completely visual. It was the work. You go through the art, and in the art you get some kind of remains of the science of the times. Though I was interested in this kind of small rests of residues of science that were kind of sleeping out in the arts. So I was also interested in beyond the factual things of looking at what's happening in science in the arts, to look at the theoretical work of the Jesuits, in which the visual imaginary and the allegories were very important. But I agree completely with you. If we go to the center of the times, then it will be scholastic philosophy. But I am always interested in going against the central things. For example, my work in mathematics, in philosophy, has been to go strongly against the analytic tradition, analytic Anglo-Saxon tradition in the philosophy of mathematics of the last 200 years, and to try to explain, on the contrary, that the importance of imaginary thinking in mathematics is fundamental. So here also, I was trying to rescue this kind of visual perspectives from the Baroque thinkers, in order to provide some kind of basic theoretical basics to my very local findings. But you are completely right. If you go to the most of the usual works in which were doing at the time, it was scholastic and just philosophically reading without images. But there was a parallel tradition of imaginary, and that's the one that I'm interested in.
Thank you very much, Professor Fernando Zalamea. It's time for the coffee break. So in 15 minutes at 11:30 Mexico time, we are coming back. 15 minutes, 15 minutos para el break. Muchas gracias.
Ya, si quieres ya. Pues muy buenas tardes. Estamos de regreso en el segundo día del Simposium sobre Matemáticas y Ciencia Barroca en el México Colonial. Le queremos dar la bienvenida a la doctora Alice Brook y le agradecemos mucho que pueda tomarse un tiempito para platicarnos sobre sus investigaciones. Les voy a platicar un poquito sobre quién es Alice Brook. Ella es tutora en español en el Merton College de la Universidad de Oxford. Su campo de investigación es la literatura y la cultura del mundo hispano durante el periodo temprano moderno, especialmente de la Nueva España. Específicamente, ella se interesa en la cultura religiosa, la producción escrita por mujeres y la relación entre el pensamiento religioso y la indagación científica durante el periodo temprano moderno. En su primer libro, que se los recomiendo mucho, búsquenlo por ahí en internet, explora la presencia de las ideas empíricas en los autos sacramentales, obras de teatro de Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Pues muchísimas gracias, doctor Alice. Y bienvenida a Puebla, aunque sea a la distancia.
Pues muchas gracias. Y muchas gracias a Carlos, a Elizabeth, Natalie, Armando por la invitación y por organizar un simposio tan estimulante y fascinante sobre un tema creo que muy importante. Con la presentación creo que mejor si lo presentan ustedes, que no me sale ver la presentación en pantalla completa junto con el texto de la presentación.
¿Ver?
Sí.
¿Sí la puedes ver? Perfecto. y ya yo desde aquí tú me dices que cuando le pase, yo desde aquí la manipulo.
Perfecto. Sí.
Perfecto. Gracias, Alice. Adelante.
Sí, perfecto. So, in one of the best-known passages of Sor Juana's Respuesta a Sor Filotea, the poet describes standing in a convent dormitory and observing the illusory appearance of the room's walls and ceilings. Although she knows that the walls run parallel to one another and perpendicular both to the opposing wall and to the ceiling, they appear to her eyes as if they run along a diagonal, leading to a far wall that is much smaller than the near one. In the past 2 decades, several scholars, including Jeremy Robbins, Emily Bergman, and Frederick Luciani, have highlighted the significance of this passage, identifying its engagement both with early modern theories of optics, especially the principle of single-point perspective, and with an emerging intellectual willingness to rely on observation and experimentation. Given the critical attention this paragraph has received and the iconic status it has attained within accounts of Juana's intellectual formation, it is curious to note the paucity of scholarly attention given to the passage that immediately follows it, which displays considerable similarities to the observation of the dormitory. In this instance, Juana considers the movement of a spinning top when set in motion by 2 young girls. Estaban en mi presencia 2 niñas jugando con un trompo, cuando empecé con esta mi locura a considerar el fácil moto de la forma esférica y cómo duraba el impulso ya impreso e independiente de su causa, pues distante de la mano de la niña, que era la causa motiva, bailaba el trompillo. Y no contenta con esto, hice traer harina y sarnerla para que bailando el trompo encima se conociese si eran círculos perfectos o no los que describía con su movimiento. Y hallé que no eran sino unas líneas espirales que iban perdiendo lo circular cuando se iba remitiendo el impulso. The second passage, however, is yet to receive the kind of careful scholarly attention paid to the first, either in terms of identifying the precise scientific principles at work in it, or in assessing their relationship to wider epistemological and philosophical currents of the late 17th century. Those critics who have considered the passage have tended to interpret it neoplatonically, focusing on the symbolic value of the spiral as part of the secret correspondences that informed Juana's understanding of the created world as a reflection of the divine. According to this view, the spiral shape created by the spinning top is to be understood as evidence for the universal harmony that pervades creation. So current readings of these 2 passages epitomise, as the abstract for the Simposium articulates, those tensions within 17th century science where speculative thought and occult ideas were mixed with careful observation and the centering of mathematical reason and instruments. In essence, each of the aforementioned assessments of the Respuesta seeks to unpack these tensions and, specifically, to address a central question: just how modern was Sor Juana's thought? To what extent are her writings evidence of her engagement with scientific developments circulating elsewhere across the Atlantic world? And to what extent do they remain wedded to older ways of thinking? In this paper, I seek to further elucidate this very question, with particular attention to Sor Juana's account of the spinning top. I will argue that in this passage she exhibits what has been described elsewhere as a Janus-like tendency, simultaneously looking back to much older patterns of thought, while also looking forward, anticipating more advanced mathematical questions than even her contemporaries were posing. So already from a cursory reading, we can outline several significant features of Juana's account of the spinning top, especially when it's read as contiguous to her account of single-point perspective, as viewed in the convent dormitory. So first, when viewing the passages side by side, we see a progression from observation to experiment. In the example of the dormitory, Juana stands in a preformed space and observes what she sees. In the case of the spinning top, she actively manipulates her environment by covering the floor with flour and spinning the top across it in order to test the hypothesis that the top moves in perfect circles. Second, the field of inquiry underlying Juana's observation shifts from optics to mechanics. This is contextually important and goes some way to explain why Juana's account of the spinning top has received less critical attention than her observation of the dormitory. While the study of optics has been a growing field of inquiry in relation to the early modern Hispanic world, the field of mechanics has received less attention, particularly as regards its influence on broader cultural production. It was nonetheless an important discipline in the period, especially as it related to planetary motion. Indeed, the two fields are closely related in disciplinary terms, perhaps as closely as they are in the narrative of Juana's text. Advances in the understanding of planetary motion were made possible by anticipatory progress in optics, specifically in the fabrication of lenses required for the operation of telescopes. Third, Juana moves from describing an already well-established principle of optics to investigating a much more complex and less well-understood problem of mechanics. As Jeremy Robbins explains, Juana's narration of her observation of the dormitory was somewhat disingenuous. The principle of single-point perspective she purports to uncover was well established by the 17th century and would have been accessible to her in countless Ars Pictorica published from the early Renaissance onwards. The mechanics of the spinning top, in contrast, was not a well-established phenomenon in the late 17th century, although it appears frequently in treatises on mechanics from the late medieval through to the Enlightenment. The top presents a much more complex problem, involving centrifugal rotation, precession, and motion across a surface. Certain aspects of the top's properties had a long history of discussion in mechanical thought, but even these were in flux by the time Juana was writing. Other aspects, including the question of the motion of a top across a surface, appears in this period to be unique to the Respuesta and not found in other contemporary mathematical treatises. So my analysis of Juana's account of the spinning top starts from the premise that its anecdotal presentation might conceal a deeper engagement with theoretical sources. Specifically, it argues that Juana's text demonstrates an advanced knowledge of early modern mechanics that is grounded in pre-Newtonian physics, but that is also aligned with an empirical questioning of Aristotelian theory. At the same time, I argue, Juana poses questions of what she observes that go beyond what contemporary treatises on mechanics investigated or proposed, and are remarkably accurate in their claims. So any account of early modern mechanics necessarily starts with Aristotle's physics. In this work, Aristotle outlines the central presumption of natural motion, that the natural state of objects is to be at rest in a location determined by their material characteristics. So heavy objects fall, while light objects, such as smoke, rise. For an object to move, it must be moved by some agent. However, as Aristotle observes, some objects continue to move when no longer in contact with the mover. If everything that is in motion is being moved by something, how comes it that certain things, missiles for example, that are not self-moving, nevertheless continue their motion without a break when no longer in contact with the agent that gave them motion? So the question that Aristotle poses here is fundamentally similar to the one Juana asks herself on observing the spinning top. Cómo duraba el impulso ya impreso e independiente de su causa, pues distante de la mano de la niña, que era la causa motiva, bailaba el trompillo. Aristotle posits two theories as to how this continued motion occurs. The first, that the air is moved from its place in front of the object to behind the object, and that this keeps the object in motion. The second, that the object is moved by the medium through which it moves, which he terms antiperistasis. The language of Juana's observation, however, and specifically her use of the term impulso, points to a knowledge of later sources that critiqued the Aristotelian model. Significantly, her use of the spinning top as an example suggests her engagement with later thinkers, and thus of a possible intertextual reading of the passage. So in his commentary on the physics, The 14th century French philosopher Jean Buridan uses the example of the spinning top and the Smith's mill to dispute both of Aristotle's explanations for continued motion, especially as it concerns centrifugal rotation. So Buridan rejects both of Aristotle's explanation for motion at a distance. First, since the spinning top and the Smith's mill rotate in situ, or so he theorises, they do not leave their place, and so the air cannot follow along and fill the space they leave behind. He writes, the first experience concerns the top, the trochus, and the Smith's mill, which are moved for a long time and yet do not leave their places. Hence, it is not necessary for the air to follow along to fill up the place of departure of a top of this kind and a Smith's mill. Second, Buridan explains, if one were to cut off the air around the top or the mill, for example by surrounding it with fabric, this would not impede their motion, from which we can conclude that the surrounding medium, so in this case air, cannot be the cause of their continued motion. Instead, Buridan formulates the notion of impetus or of motive force, or what he calls virtus motiva, the notion that the motor or projector impresses on the object a certain force, which keeps it in motion. This force decreases over time due to the resistance of the surrounding medium or the force of gravity, and he explains the concept as follows. Thus we can and ought to say that in the stone or other projectile there is impressed something which is the motive force of that projectile. Therefore, it seems to me that it ought to be said that the motor in moving a moving body impresses in it a certain impetus or a certain motive force on the moving body in the direction toward which the mover was moving the moving body. But that impetus is continually decreased by the resisting air and by the gravity of the stone, which inclines it in a direction contrary to that in which the impetus was naturally predisposed to move it. So here we see a much closer analogy to Juana's account, both in Buridan's choice of the example of the top as a counterproof to Aristotle's theory, and in the lexical similarities between his account and Juana's. If we take her impulso as a translation of Buridan's impetus, her account is framed through Spanish calques of Buridan's key terms, the impulso ya impreso from his impetus imprimimit, la causa motiva for virtus motiva, and remitiendo el impulso for impetus remititor. The understanding Juana articulates of the motion of the top here is consonant with Buridan's theory. She clearly expresses that the top is set in motion by the girl's hand, acting here as the projector, which impresses upon it an impetus or motive force, causing it to spin, and that this impetus decreases over time, causing the motion of the top to become irregular and eventually, one assumes, come to rest. Given the commonalities in example, language, and understanding of the phenomenon of motion, I argue that Juana's account of the spinning top is drawn from a reading of Buridan's commentary on Aristotle. This awareness modulates our understanding of Juana's relationship to Aristotelian thought. Despite his critique of Aristotelian anti-peristasis, Buridan's treatise is to be situated fundamentally within the Aristotelian tradition. He is post-Aristotelian rather than anti-Aristotelian. By citing Buridan, therefore, Juana allies herself with the post-Aristotelian tradition, but does so specifically by homing in on a point of critique of Aristotelian mechanics. At the same time, this complicates our understanding of her relationship to experiential learning. While Juana posits her observation as derived from experience and makes no explicit reference to a textual source, the identification between her account and Buridan's text calls this anecdotal presentation of her learning into question. In this sense, her knowledge becomes much more grounded in theory than is usually acknowledged. This conclusion aligns with what Robbins has noted with reference to her account of her observation of single-point perspective in the dormitory. On the other hand, the recognition of Juana's textual source, somewhat counterintuitively, serves actually to place greater emphasis on the importance of experience, since Buridan himself frames his discussion of Aristotle through the very language of experiencia. It is through observation of the Smith's mill and the top that he comes to critique Aristotle's theory of antiperistasis. In this sense, Juana's passage requires a double emphasis on experience, first in her own account posited as one of direct observation, and secondly, through the experiential framing of her source text. At the same time as Juana's text engages with post-Aristotelian mechanics, however, it also anticipates certain questions that were fundamental to contemporary and even more modern advances in mechanical theory, particularly those related to the new classical or Newtonian mechanics. Such advances upended the Aristotelian theory by introducing the concept of inertia, that is, that objects put into motion will remain in uniform motion in a straight line, unless their state is changed by an external force, such as resistance or gravity. For mathematicians concerned with the revolutions occurring in the field of mechanics, the spinning top is a recurrent object of observation and inquiry. Indeed, Newton himself employs the object to illustrate how his first law of motion, which describes the law of inertia, also applies to circular motion. As it turns, each part of the top pulls in a straight line, and together these various forces produce rotation. Prior to Newton, Giovanni Benedetti had used the top for the same purpose of disputing Aristotelian mechanics and explaining the confluence between apparently circular and rectilinear motion. Other thinkers employed the spinning top to explore further questions of mechanics. Bernardino Baldi, for example, considered how the top remained upright while rotating, yet fell to the ground when this ceased. Likewise, Johannes Kepler used the momentum of the top to consider a hypothesis for the motion of the planets. Now, aside perhaps from Kepler, it is unlikely that Juana was familiar with any of these sources. Bernadetti's explanation is included in personal correspondence and unpublished. Newton's Principia was published in 1687, only 4 years prior to Juana writing the Respuesta. Furthermore, Juana does not appear interested in the same questions that the trained mathematicians were posing. She does not think in terms of inertia. She is clear that the top comes to rest by the reduction in impetus, not the resistance of the air or gravity. Nor is she concerned, as Baldi was, with the top's gravity-defying abilities. Juana does, however, pose a question of the top that none of her contemporaries appear to consider or to investigate, namely its motion across the floor, and whether its trace is perfectly circular. By covering the floor with flour and spinning the top across its surface, Juana discovers that its trace is not circular at all, but rather a spiral. Among critics who have considered the passage, most have taken her conclusion to be primarily symbolic. So as Sainz writes, Sor Juana parece querer demostrar por medio de ejemplos empíricos que la naturaleza es hija de Dios. De hecho, espera que el impulso de la peonza se acabe en una suerte de comprobación empírica. Las espirales que Sor Juana entrevé en el juego de las niñas le indica el fundamento de la naturaleza, la clave de la máquina del mundo. What has gone largely unremarked, however, is the fact that Juana was indeed correct in her conclusion, and the significance of this in the context of modern understandings of mechanics. The theory of the spiral motion of the top was not postulated theoretically until the early 19th century, when Siméon Poisson explored the question in his Traité de mécanique. Even more strikingly, it was only demonstrated in practice in the mid-20th century, in an experiment remarkably similar to Sor Juana's. In 1952, A.D. Fokker published an article in the journal Physics, in which he detailed an experiment in which he had spun a top over sheets of tracing paper, such as those used for typewriters, thus allowing the point or peg to impress a trace across the page, demonstrating that the top's path does indeed proceed along the shape of unas líneas espirales que iban perdiendo lo circular. Fokker's experiment is undeniably more complex than Juana's, involving various adjustments to the pegs in order to test the effects of various dimensions, inertia coefficients, and spinning velocities. Nonetheless, the central question posed, and the experiment designed to answer it, are fundamentally the same as those described in the Respuesta. In conclusion, therefore, Sor Juana's observation of the spinning top clearly demonstrates her cultural immersion in the concerns and methods of Aristotelian and post-Aristotelian mechanics, particularly the commentary by Jean Buridan. The connections between their respective accounts of the top's motion moderate our reading of the passage as a straightforward account of autobiographical anecdote, instead revealing it as a complex interplay between text and experience. It demonstrates the continued influence on her thinking of Aristotelian mechanics and their legacy, even when she homes in on critiques to these older strands of thought. At the same time, it suggests ways in which Sor Juana was capable of thinking beyond her time, proposing and exploring questions not even anticipated by her contemporary professional mathematicians, and ones that would remain unanswered for over a century to come. Thank you.
Now, thank you so much, Dr. Alice, because your talk was amazing. So, tenemos 5 minutitos para alguna pregunta que puedan o que quieran formularle aquí la audiencia que tenemos en el salón, o no sé si haya alguien en línea. ¿Todavía tienes tiempo, Alice? Porque nos habías comentado algo.
Sí, tengo otra media hora.
Ah,
sí.
Perfecto. Entonces, si quieren interactuar con ella, unos 5 minutitos que tenemos para formular una pregunta. Sí, por supuesto, claro.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation. I have a question. My background is in philosophy, medieval philosophy, and I'm specialized in Occam. And Buridan was an alchemist in many senses. And my question is, do you know or have you found any book or author that might be read by Sor Juana? I have an article actually on Primero Sueño where I try to demonstrate that she was a nominalist. And so now I know that there were books from nominalist, alchemist and nominalist here in New Spain. So probably she was in contact with these books. But about Buridan, that's what I would like to know, if you have any clue on that.
So it's really difficult to know exactly what she read, to know exactly what was contained in her library. I think there has been perhaps a lack of emphasis on the more Aristotelian sources on Occam, for example. I'd be really interested in reading what you have to say about Primero Sueño and the nominalist reading of it. So I haven't been able to trace, for example, copies circulating. My sense is that the similarities in the language suggest that she's read it. We know that it was a text that circulated very, very widely. It's the principal commentary on the physics that is circulating in the period. So my hunch is that it is something with which she would have been familiar, just because it circulates so widely.
Thank you very much. Tenemos 15 minutos para llevar a cabo una discusión colectiva antes del receso para ir a tomar el lunch. Hemos tenido 3 participaciones el día de hoy. Chen Morris, Fernando Salamea. Professor Fernando Salamea is still connected. Está todavía en línea el profesor Salamea. Y también la profesora Alice Brooks.
Brooke, sin ese.
Sin ese. Gracias.
De nada.
Por aquí tenemos una pregunta de Robert Jackson.
More of a commentary, but yesterday Natalie asked me if the Jesuit economy was Baroque. My response was very much so. But I'm thinking about that, and also this very interesting presentation about the La Decima Musa. The contradictions in Baroque and the contradiction and tensions between belief and the advent of science. And I'm going to just make a very quick commentary about two Jesuit incidents. Have to do not with physical science, but with medicine. First one, 1727, a very strong measles epidemic in Mexico City. And in one of the small parish churches on the outskirts of Mexico City, there's a very interesting painting which shows what was the Jesuit response. And response to a lot of the incidents when they interpreted natural disasters and epidemics as God's wrath. They organized a novena, 9 days of processions. They took the statue of the Virgen de Loreto, which was the favorite devotion of the Jesuits, out of the Church of San Gregorio. They did a procession to the cathedral, and then they did this for 9 days. The second one was a document from 1738 from the Jesuit missions among the Guarani in South America. And here we see this kind of contradiction. A very strong smallpox epidemic began in 1738, eventually killed about 38,000 Guarani. Now, what was the response, the Jesuit response? Well, they also continued with the processions, but here's the interesting twist. There's a document to describe how do we respond to this. And the document said, we do quarantine, we separate the sick and those who had been exposed to a temporary hospital, we establish a temporary cemetery, and we basically leave them off there to die to try to protect the healthy population. So it doesn't describe that we're going to go out and do processions. It describes that early medical practices that date back to the late medieval period, epidemics, quarantine, try to protect those who are healthy. And then this third commentary, Sor-Juana, La Décima Musa, extreme contradiction between the quest for knowledge and the social realities. You know, she came from a middling background, and yet she was one of these great intellects. She went mano a mano con Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, and I think she kind of proved herself to be more of an intellect than he was. So this is just kind of these contradictions, but it's a time of faith, but it's also a time of advent, of new understanding, and how science and medicine was beginning to filter in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any reaction from Fernando or Alice to this comment?
Perhaps I would say that this kind of contradiction seems really at the heart of many of the conceptual understanding of the Baroque and the practices also. And I think also in the part that I was interested, it is clear in the Deleuze interpretation. In the Deleuze interpretation, you have very clearly the opposites, the contradictions, and from the contradictions, then you gain knowledge. That's very clear in Deleuze, it's very clear in the Horopteron by Aguilonius. I think it's very clear everywhere. So I agree completely with that important comment.
Thank you very much, Professor Salamea. I'm going to read a comment from the YouTube chat. It's from Olimpia Figueras at Simvestaff. She says, la ponencia de Alice sí que fue asombrosa. Me gustaría tener referencias de sus investigaciones. Alice, if you can send us some more references, or if we can share those in your slides, that will be good.
Yeah, so this is and this is work in progress. So and this will obviously feed into the conference proceedings. But if it's the easiest thing if I put a couple of links into the chat. So this emerges in part from so I've just recently published translation and critical edition of the crisis and the respuesta, so you have the full exchange. This comes out of the work there with those texts, but this kind of more specifically is then feeding into next projects. But I'll put something in the chat.
Thank you very much, Alice. We have time for one more question or comment. Una pregunta o comentario más que quieran hacer. Tú tienes.
Bueno, si tengo pregunta for Professor Zalamea, could you say a little more about the Charles Peirce part of the presentation, in particular the dense symbolic and the way that factored into your analysis?
Okay, Professor De Freitas. I will share you here the presentation. Here you have the Persian perspective, in which you understand a sign through its representations. For example, here we can take a sign of a mathematical sign represented in the arts of New Spain, or the same sign represented in the arts of New Granada, and you can see in every context how they will react in the context. So my idea was that the context of New Spain is a context where you have a lot more correlations, and particularly speculative correlations, as the beautiful presentation of Alice showed the richness of this kind of intellectual understanding of some practices. And instead, in the New Granada context, I would say that you have a much less interesting correlation between speculation and practice, and it becomes to be more related to practices of the practical sciences. So I would in this New Spain context. Since you have more correlations, more representations, more richness, then you have some kind of density, and that density is represented by symbols. Instead, in New Granada, you don't have that density, you have something more discrete, not so continuous. They are just indexes of something happening, and those indexes show like a kind of thought, speculative thought related to the practices. But as I was saying, that's not necessarily a drawback, because also from this idea of having shadows or residues, you can get a lot of information. A good example of that is of course Walter Benjamin, 19th century, the Archives project, in which he tries to develop a beautiful understanding of 19th century France from the residues in the archives. Here I am saying that in the New Granada context, the residues are poor. Instead, in the residues in the New Spain are a little richer, so I call them dense, and you can check that in the lists of the many motifs. When you go to the details, you can see that there are a lot of more clear representations of mathematics in New Spain than in New Granada.
Here, one more question. Yes.
Really just a comment on this topic of contradiction and thinking with the image of the Riemann surface that Professor Zalamea showed us, which is, I think it's a tendency of modernity to think that we have worked out the contradictions. But one of the things that we get from working with Deleuze and the fold is the way in which these contradictions keep coming back and becoming generative. And I think we saw this, we can imagine where that goes next as we keep going above those folds and unfolding. And just something to keep in mind, because looking for those contradictions is an interesting methodological kind of adventure, and making us alert to when they might come up again, so that the Baroque is not finished. It continues to be a generative concept.
It's very alive, yes, I think so.
Yes, I know we're about to close in 2 minutes because we're on a very strict schedule for lunch, so we want to make sure we all come back directly after lunch. But I just wanted to respond to the query on YouTube and to share with all of you here, as well as the speakers, that we're really looking forward to the proceedings and working together with any participants and working together to produce something that will come out of the conference. So for those of you who have been here and who are interested, keep your ears open, and there'll be more coming. Thank you.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Nos vemos aquí nuevamente. Vamos a hacer la pausa en este momento. Nos vemos aquí nuevamente a la 1:30 en punto, por favor. Tenemos que ser muy disciplinados con el tiempo porque nuestros participantes están conectados en línea en este día. Muchas gracias.